So, Pain and Glory is Pedro Almodovar's new film, and I gotta say, I really like that. There's a surreal and kind of like quiet sensation to this film, which I feel like might have the best performance I've ever seen from Antonio Banderas. So Antonio Banderas plays Salvador Malo, and we see him through two different lenses. We see him in his older age, after he's become an accomplished director. He's kind of distanced himself from everyone. He lives in a very lavish house. And we kind of cut between that and his childhood when he was growing up in a small village of construction workers where he was kind of a child prodigy. And he was the most literate person there that he would teach like adults how to read and write. So we see the makings of a great director, and we catch up with him in the aftermath of being a great director, but having troubles behind him. So we sort of leave that part of his life in the middle when he was actually a director, when it seemed like he had the most conflict and the most troubles within his life, and we kind of just leave it there in like a blank space, and we kind of leave it up to Salvador to tell the story to most of us. And it's interesting because Salvador, he kind of narrates some of the film he lets us in on just enough of what we need to know. Like, he tells us about his history, how when he went to school, he was a prodigy in certain areas of like singing and film that he shoved aside other parts of his education. We learn that he has a problem with his spine, and that he has health problems that keep on mounting of headaches and pain and migraines. And it's interesting how he tells us this information, because whenever it seems like we're getting the more focused and technical side of Salvador, the soundtrack kind of shifts to this kind of computerized, kind of like a computerized synth, where it kind of feels like we're watching more like the sounds of a computer going than actually watching a human being dealing with feelings. And I like these choices in the soundtrack, because when we have that music, we kind of feel like there's a focus in there, like everything else is shut out in the world, and we're just paying attention to this one thing in Salvador's life. And then on the other side of the coin, whenever there's moments that feel kind of quiet and curious and strange, the music kind of takes this somewhat gentle and kind of curious approach to to how the soundtrack is formed. So I like this kind of bouncing between these different aspects, because it kind of paints this portrait of how Salvador feels in his older age and looking back on the past here. Now he has a bit of a troubled past, with his actors and people he used to know. He's kind of pushed them aside, and it feels like it feels like there's this lifetime of trouble behind him, and that he kind of has to make amends for it, or he wants to come to terms with it. And this mostly happens because the film he directed many years ago has apparently been restored, and there's going to be this somewhat big theatrical screening of it again. So he takes a look at the film before it goes, to the theater. We don't see the film, at least for most of the picture, we don't see it. But we hear that, it's kind of changed him. It's kind of invigorated him. It's kind of inspired him to actually go back into the past and find out what made him the way he was, and reconnect with people he's kind of shoved aside. But more importantly, it inspires him to get back into writing, and try to, work out a new film or a new play, and just try to get back into the swing of things, what made him feel that great way that he did so many years ago. So there's this nostalgia element to it, but it's very sincere how it goes about it, because I love how Salvador kind of looks back on his life with kind of this sort of just curiosity than anything, and this kind of love for nostalgia. At one point he mentions that he used to watch movies in a cinema where the kids would, in order to imitate the water on the screen, they would urinate in the theater. And so he says, when I think of the cinema, I think of piss, pretty much. Now that would sound like, a fairly hilarious bit of thing. Obviously we don't see the piss or anything. He just relays this information. And we would, and just hearing that, you'd probably laugh at that. But, to hear it come from him so sincerely and heartfelt, I think that really defines a lot of what makes the film so great, is because he looks back in his life that had romantic problems and problems with with people he's worked with and problems with drugs, and he kind of like looks back on it with kind of like a peculiar nature, and kind of like with this different mindset of how he views life now that all this seems behind him. So there's this nostalgic twinge for the problems as well. So like when he invites like an actor he used to work with back into his life, they connect over movies, and they do some drugs together, but at the same time they're also still conflicted. But I love how Salvador seems so kind of like distant. Like he's always been. It seems like he's been pretty quiet in his older age, and even when he's coming to terms with these other people, he's still quiet, and he's still just kind of like just mesmerized by the world and try to figure it out. That he's willing to invite these feuds and this heartbreak back into his life. Like at one point he reconnects with a former lover of his. They spend one night together, but then they realize they've led much different lives. Like the partner that he was originally going to be with, he went on to be married to a woman, and then they had children, and then they divorced. So he's in this odd spot where he's not quite sure if he wants to let himself back in. I especially love how he's so distant that even when they host like a Q&A of his screening, he basically doesn't come. He would rather just stay at home and do drugs with his friend, because that seems to be like where he wants to be in his life. Like he wants to be within nostalgia, but he doesn't want to be within the kind of like the more comforting ways, the more comforting arms of nostalgia, because he knows that if he goes to the screening, they're going to ask him kind of somewhat puzzling questions, but very heartfelt questions, because everyone came to that screening to see his film, most likely because they love it. So I love the fact that he kind of like pushes aside sort of like the easy connections that he can make in the world. And it's also pretty sweet the way that Salvador tries to find a way to to make things up, even in the present, where he's still kind of like making problems for the people that he loves, but doesn't quite want to like shove away as much as he can. So it's a fairly it's somewhat nonlinear. I mean, we meander towards like his childhood and his present time. We don't really see a lot of that space in the middle there. It's shot beautifully. I love the way that it goes for the straight bold colors here. I love the choices in the soundtrack that define it, and just Banderas' performance is just so perfectly subtle. Like even in moments where it feels like he's enraged or he's very passionate, he always seems to have this brilliant weariness to his face, where we can sense that there's a little bit more going on behind his eyes, but we don't quite see it all. We can sort of see some of it come through his face, but just enough so that there's still that element of curiosity where we want to understand him more. And I love that weariness also carries into how he approaches his past. Like he's very reluctant to kind of pursue these relationships and these stories. Like it takes a little bit more out of him. And it takes a little bit of some, internal, it takes a bit of coming to terms with yourself to, for him to decide what he's going to do next in his life. So it pretty much, I wouldn't say this, it's tough to judge this among like, Almodovar's other films, because a lot of them are so classic, but I really enjoyed this film. I think it touched on so many great notes, and it feels like gentle and slow paced just enough to the point where it doesn't linger on scenes for too long, but also touches on some areas that seem somewhat hard to touch upon in film, but it does a pretty good. I like the way that every scene seems to carry a little something to it, to that degree. And also Banderas' performance is it's definitely one of like the best performances I've seen of Banderas ever. I'd have to. He's got a long filmography, so I'd have to go through every bit and piece. But right now, I think this is probably the best film he's ever done. Mostly because he's front and center, and he plays a character who's very layered and has a lot to him, and has a lot to say, and a lot of passion and a lot of fury, and most of it he keeps kind of like tightly locked away and only comes out when he wants it to. So I absolutely adored this film. So Pain and Glory, 4 out of 5 stars.